what does it mean for our democracy, right? What could that mean? So many countries have done what the United States just did for the very first time. The idea of prosecuting a head of state to Americans is unthinkable until now. But that's only for us. There's a piece in The Conversation written by James Long, Morgan Wack, and Victor Minaldo. And they wrote about the history of charging former presidents and heads of state with crimes. A few years ago, March 2021, the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, was sentenced to a year in prison for corruption and for influence peddling. Also in 2021, Benjamin Netanyahu went on trial for breaches of trust, bribery, and fraud. That's still going on. And the reason that Israelis aren't focused on that right now is because Hamas attacked on October 7th, but that is not over. On top of that, former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, was charged with money laundering and racketeering. He is still due to stand trial. That trial looks like it might happen next year. But one of the interesting things that they note is that a number of democracies have put their heads of state on trial. The one example we had of this really in our country was Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford, 50 years ago, pardoned Richard Nixon. Clear evidence that Richard Nixon had done wrong in the Watergate scandal. But Gerald Ford feared that the country, quote, would needlessly be diverted from meeting its challenges if we as a people were to remain sharply divided, unquote. Should he have gone ahead and done it and just made the example that no one is above the law? Was it better to move forward? Did that embolden what we're seeing now with Donald Trump? Because the possibility of a pardon was introduced when Gerald Ford did it for Richard Nixon. Dunno. Bigger questions than I can answer. Both of those options, whether you go after a president or you give them immunity, either one of them is risky. There's no one better option, but they play out differently depending on the age and the relative stability of the democracy. So an older democracy like France, right? The revolution was in 1789, or the United States, ours was in 1776, is going to fare very differently than a younger democracy like South Africa, which has only really been a democracy since Nelson Mandela, which is the 90s, early 90s. And what they found is that in a strong democracy like France, usually the government itself has the competence and the judiciary has the independence to go after whoever misbehaves, including its top leaders. South Korea convicted 5 former presidents. 5, starting in the 90s, going all the way up to 2018, up to President Park Geun-hye. Did South Korea fall apart? No. Depending on the nature of the country, people are going to look at it as just prosecutors having too much fun. They're going to take the Trumpian argument that it is purely political and there's no way to win. Example of this, number one for me, by far, Brazil. Brazil has been going through this back to back to back to back to back. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, jailed in 2018 for taking bribes. They thought that was the end of his political career. After being a president, then got jailed. He won another term in 2022. Right after that, former President Michel Temer was accused of accepting millions in bribes. Term ended. Temer was arrested. Trial got suspended. Lula got released and the Supreme Court annulled his conviction. He won the race against Jair Bolsonaro. Now Bolsonaro is indicted for fraud. But it hasn't blown up the democracy, nor has it prevented corrupt people from going to the presidency. Another example, Mexico's had huge issues with corruptions because their ruling party, the PRI, had this very well-established patronage system that just kind of dealt with the big dogs at the top with a lot of impunity. That's been changing. August 2022, federal prosecutors in Mexico opened a number of corruption probes, including against the former president, Enrique Peña Nieto. Money laundering charges, like big criminal charges. Will that move forward? Who knows? There are plenty of countries that have been through this. According to those scholars, they said that only 23% of countries that transitioned to democracy from 1885 to 2004 ever charged a former leader with crime. 23%, like 1 in 4 since 1885? That's a lot. So for us as Americans to look at our situation and go, oh my God, America is spinning off the rails. We're flying off into space. How could this possibly be happening? Whoa, whoa, whoa. This happens more often than we think. How much corruption were we really dealing with in the White House before Donald Trump? Right, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton got disbarred for lying in his testimony. But lying about what? An affair with Monica Lewinsky. America's experience with thoroughly corrupt heads of state is extremely low. Screwy policies, bad decisions, sure. But this kind of corruption, America is still batting about 800. Not 1,000, but damn close. So the idea that I would look at the Trump situation as a sign that everything is spiraling out of control, I'm not so sure. It should not happen, but it happens. And it happens to countries that we know. France is one of our strongest allies. It's not like South Korea is cut off from the world. How many of you watch Squid Game on your Samsung and then listen to BTS when you were done, right? This isn't South Sudan. This is South Korea. It happens. I mentioned South Africa. Jacob Zuma, former president in South Africa, dealt with corruption charges, so he got washed out. Cyril Ramaphosa is the current president under the ANC. The ANC has been ruling South Africa since Nelson Mandela. Well, South Africa went to the polls this weekend for their parliamentary elections, and they're counting the votes. They're about 42% of the way through. Guess who's not doing well in the polls right now in South Africa? Right. According to Reuters, the latest count shows that the ANC might lose its majority in South Africa's parliament for the first time since Nelson Mandela became the president. From the last election, they got about 57.5% of the votes last time in 2019. Now it's looking like less than 43%. And if that was the case, they might not be able to hold it together and get a majority with alliances with small parties. They got 3 rivals, none of whom they're really friends with, because you've got the Democratic Alliance, which is a pro-business party. At the moment, they've got about 23.5% of the vote. Jacob Zuma, the former president who got in all that trouble with corruption, has been leading a new party called the MK Party. MK's got about 10%. Then there's another party, radical left party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF. They've got 9.5%. They would be hard to make an alliance with because EFF is recommending things like seizing land from white South Africans. That could get very, very weird. So the idea that freedom-loving people in a democracy, especially even a young democracy like South Africa, just can't see which way is up, I'm not so sure. There's evidence that they will, and I would watch the various democracies around the world that are going to the polls, especially South Africa, India, Mexico, and this one, to see what we know about democracies today. It's not as cut and dried as you might think.